had a little quote that I was going to kickstart with because I was watching your first TED Talk, I believe it was today. It's had like 11 million views, which absolutely blew my mind. We'll get into that in just a moment. But for better or worse, I commonly like find myself in the comment section of YouTube videos, and there was one taking a quote of yours from the speech you made with 4,000 likes. It said, "We're hallucinating all at the same time, even right now. It's just when we agree about our hallucinations that we call it reality." I thought that might be a really nice quote just to introduce the subject of what we're about to get into and maybe give an overview to everyone what it is that you're actually speaking about there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good quote to pick up on. It turned out to be one of the ones that, for better or worse, landed when I was giving the TED Talk back in 2017. And what I'm trying to get at there with that quote is this idea that it seems as though we each experience the world just as it is. You know, we open our eyes in the morning and there's a world there with all its objects and people and places and colors and shapes. It seems as though the world exists in the sense we experience it in a way that doesn't really depend on us. It's just there. Evolution has made very sure that that's the case, but that is not actually what's happening. What's happening, at least what I think is happening, and I think what an emerging view in neuroscience and psychology philosophy is settling on, is that what we experience is not this kind of passive registration of an objective reality. It's an active construction. The brain is always making its best guess about what's out there, and that's what we experience, this best guess. And it's not arbitrary. You know, evolution again has made very sure that the way we experience the world is a way that's very useful for us in behaving, so that we don't get run over by cars or eaten by lions or whatever it might be, or bitten by funnel web spiders. Although that probably still happens, probably not very good at that. And so there's a kind of similarity, there's a consensus, which again is very unsurprising, that you and I, if we were in the same place rather than opposite sides of the world, would experience more or less the same thing, but probably not exactly the same thing. But we will, we'll use the same words often. The car is red, the spider is over there, and so that helps build this consensus, and that's what we take to then be real. Our perception has a character of being real, even though it's a construction. And then if our experiences are similar enough, we also, that gives it another kind of consensus that embeds this assumption that our experience is identical to reality, when in fact it can only ever be indirectly related to what's out there.
So interesting how for granted you often take it that you're seeing the world exactly as another person is. And I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, as you say, it really does make sense. But there's more basic artistic and not even necessarily artistic, but just when it comes to recognizing beauty, like say a person, there seems for the most part to be like a fairly general consensus on like, okay, well, I can see that person's quite attractive. And I mean, that even takes in that subjective kind of thought pattern. So I feel like I stump my toe on this from time to time because as you say, you go, okay, you watch out for the spider because for our survival, that's probably the best thing to do. But even more subjective things like beauty or a sunset, it seems to strike a certain chord in the same way for so many of us.
It does, but I think there we're more open to the fact that differences happen, that what I find beautiful might not be exactly the same as somebody else. And if we think about art, if we go and see an art pieces of paintings in an art gallery, then it's pretty widely accepted that some people will like some stuff but not other stuff, and there can be a huge variance. In humor as well, what's funny to somebody might really not be funny to somebody else. I'm sure you might notice this from time to time. But it's when we get to the more fundamental aspects of our world that it's much easier to take it for granted that we're all experiencing things in the same way. And I think that's because there's a difference in how the feeling seems to us. So if I look at a painting, then my response to it seems subjective. It doesn't seem to be necessarily inherent in the painting. But if I look at an object in front of me, my experience of it seems relatively objective. It doesn't seem to have much to do with me. So it's therefore easier to assume that it's same for somebody else. And of course, again, then we use the same words and so on. And another context where I think this is really sort of, there are interesting parallels, but also interesting differences, is in social media. We have this phenomenon, of course, of echo chambers in the media in general, but in social media in particular. And here's a situation where, again, if everybody sort of is saying the same thing, it becomes quite easy to take what they're saying as obviously true. You just take it for granted that that's reality. So there's a social consensus, I think, is really a strong cue for what we take as being real. And so rather than look at how people behave on Twitter or X or whatever it is, then I'm kind of more interested in how we encounter our actual world, our physical world, and other people in our everyday lived experience. So we're doing this big study at the moment where we've had about 40,000 people taking part, each doing a series of experiments to try to just understand, to map out this perceptual diversity, these differences in how we each experience a unique world. Currently, not much is known about this.
Yeah. I was watching the most replayed part of that TED Talk I just referred to at the outset of this conversation, and it was where you had a man sitting in a study where he had one hand hidden behind a board. I'm doing my best to explain it for anyone who hadn't seen it. Maybe you'd do a better job of explaining it, but it was amazing how closely his reaction was matched to something which on paper he should have known was quite false, but when it came to the practical side of it, seemed very real at the moment a fork came into the equation. Maybe you could paint that picture a little more clearly than what I can, and what was actually going on there.
It's really, it's a very funny video. It took me a while to track down the people who'd originally done it. Actually, it's sort of 10 years before I gave the talk, and they'd forgotten about it entirely when I got in touch with them. But the setup is it's this thing called the rubber hand illusion, and it's one of a family of different kinds of little experiments and little tricks that you can illustrate how it's not just our experiences of what's out there in the world that are kind of built on the fly by the brain, but to some extent anyway, also our experiences of who and what we are, experiences of the self and of the body. So in terms of taking things for granted, I'm just putting my hand in front of my face now, it seems very obvious to take for granted that this thing in front of my eyes is my hand. But if you think about it from the brain's perspective, it doesn't have direct access to anything, whether it's in the world or whether it's part of the body. It's just, there it is in the skull, getting electrical signals through the sensors and trying to figure out what's going on. So the brain is always faced with this problem, even for the body, trying to figure out what is the body and what is not the body. And I think it's testament to how good a job the brain does this, that for most of us, most of the time, we have no idea the brain is doing this. But you can have these little situations like the rubber hand illusion that sort of peel back the curtain a little bit and show that there's something else going on. So in the rubber hand illusion, you have somebody taking part in it, the stooge maybe, who's there. He sits in front of a table. Let's just say his left hand is hidden from his view behind a cardboard panel. And there's a fake rubber hand placed in front of him in his view, which is roughly where his real hand might normally be. He's looking at that hand. It's obviously not his hand, though it does look like a hand. Then you have the experimenter sitting on the other side of the table, takes two paintbrushes and will stroke both hands in synchrony while the guy's looking at the fake hand. Now, what happens for most, but not all people, and to different degrees, is that people will have this sort of slightly odd sense that fake hand, while they know it's not part of their body, it feels to some extent, varying, that it is part of their body. And there are many ways you can test this, but in the video, the fun way is that another guy comes into the room with a fork and stabs the rubber hand. And this this causes this fairly strong reaction on the going. There are other sort of more scientific, quantitative ways to deal with it all. So why does this happen? Well, the standard story is that from the brain's perspective, it's trying to figure out what's going on, and it can see a hand, roughly where a hand might plausibly be. It can see this hand being touched by a paintbrush. And there's also this feeling of touch because the real hand is also being touched at the same time. So you've got this congruence of visual, tactile information. So the standard story is, well, that's just enough evidence for the brain to make a best guess of like, okay, yeah, I know it's not my hand, but whatever, that's enough evidence that I'm going to treat it to some extent as part of my hand. But just to draw a line under this, I used that example in the TED Talk 7 years ago, and much more of my time than expected has been spent in the subsequent years with colleagues here at Sussex, like a colleague of mine, Pete Lush, trying to figure out actually what's going on. And it turns out the story is probably not this simple story of just the brain integrating the tactile and the visual information. There's this older story in psychology about, for some people, they're very what used to be called hypnotically suggestible. So their brains are very capable of generating experiences in context that suggests that they ought to have that kind of experience. Psychologists also call it demand characteristics and so on. So that seems to be a really important part of it, that people have this experience because the whole setup is encouraging them to have it. You've got a fake hand, someone's asking you, is it your hand? It's all very lined up to implicitly suggest to the participant that something funny is happening to their hand. It still fits into the overall story because that's basically a form of the brain making a prediction about what's going to happen. But the mechanisms that are responsible for it might be actually quite complex and quite different from what we originally thought.
Yeah, so in the same way that someone might be a little more suggestible to the guide of a hypnotist, someone might be a little bit more eager or more likely to buy into the idea that what they're experiencing is a real hand, a real feeling. It's going to be real consequences if they don't move it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we're all hypnotizable to some degree or other. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just a thing. And it's a very stable trait we have, like height or eye color or something. Probably not as stable as that, but pretty stable. And that's exactly what's happening. It's not that people are just going along with it and saying what they think they should say. It's that these people have the experiences they say they have, but it's because their psychological makeup is allowing them to do that.
Yeah, that's one thing that I often find when I listen to you speak or read what you have to say, is there's so many overlapping factors, which makes this incredibly interesting, incredibly complex, and perhaps why people like me really enjoy those simple illustrations, because it's like, see, what he's saying does make sense. He tried to move his fake hand.
Yeah.
But just to put a pin in this psychological factor that might lead someone to be a little bit more likely to move it in a situation like that. This might be out of your wheelhouse a little bit, but have you done much research into what it is that makes a person like that a little more likely to buy into it, or a little more likely to be, impacted in the way that guy was?
I've been involved, to some extent. So this is a strong interest of many of my colleagues here at Sussex. Pete Lush and other guys, Zoltan DNS, have been studying this for ages, and it's got kind of a bad rap. If you say hypnosis, people think of stage trickery and these big kind of theatrical events and hypnotists waving watches and so on, and it doesn't have to involve any of that. It's just a different degrees of openness to the context you're in. It's also been called suggestibility, which again has a bit of it's not a great word because people don't like to be suggestible. It sort of suggests that they're gullible in some way, but it doesn't mean that either. So there's a sort of terminological thing. At the moment we call it phenomenological control, but that's very far too many syllables in that. But it at least gets away from the historical baggage. And why are some people more able to do this than others? it's a very good and open question. One of the things that has been found, by my colleagues here and others, is that it doesn't really correlate with anything else. So, it doesn't correlate with IQ. It doesn't correlate with any of the other sort of big five personality characteristics. So it seems to be its own thing, and quite why people do that. I think there's good reason for this to happen in general, because I see it as just this sort of higher level, almost more social extension of what our brains are doing all the time when we perceive things, which is using context to figure out what's going on. But it is kind of surprising, maybe, that there's so much variation among people. Some people have put people in brain scanners to figure out if they can see differences and so on, but I don't think there's a settled story yet.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I was driving the car today and just tuning up on a couple of questions, and that was one which really stood out. It's so funny, isn't it, that the deeper you go into a subject, just the different directions your questions go. And I mean, that's what I've really enjoyed about listening to yourself and seeing things like, I saw you start a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and a guy gave you that classic, is this a white and gold dress, or is this a black and blue dress? And
Oh, yeah.
I mean, a simple little, I don't know if you call it, I don't know the official name for that, but in my mind, it's just like a head spin. It's like a head spin activity. Because I look at it and I go, like, it's quite plain what that suggests. It's quite plain what it is. And your answer to the color of that dress was incorrect. And I was like, come on, Anil, like, this is very clear what color this dress is. Is that in the same category of, I mean, this is without sort of just bombarding listeners with details. I mean, little factors like lighting. I mean, there's so many variables which can dictate the way we perceive a particular object. And as you said, like, we're very, sorry to use the word suggestible again, but it seems that we are easily misled by, a variable change like lighting, or the example that you gave was a voice saying, in a robotic voice, sounds like it's saying, I'm not a fan of Brexit. Then you hear someone quite clearly, and just that voice kind of guides you back, and you go, oh, okay, of course, that's exactly what it's saying. Like, this is under the umbrella of what this particular experiment with the fork is, isn't it? But it seems to take many different shapes and sizes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just to step back for a second, I mean, one of the really beautiful things, one of the things that's really motivated me over the years, is exactly this phenomenon where something can seem very simple on the surface, but then once you start asking some questions about it, almost anything, about the way our experience unfolds, who we are, things that we would very easily take for granted, there are just layers and layers underneath that, and the more you dig into it, the more you find. And of course, that's I guess that's really why I wanted to be a scientist originally, because nature just has this depth and complexity that once you start looking into it, it just keeps on revealing more, and we understand ourselves better, as a result. Coming back to the dress, it's the blue, black, white, gold dress. That's another example of something that kind of took over the internet at the time, I think nearly 10 years ago now, and then has led to this sort of industry of people trying to figure out exactly what's going on. It's all, there is, I think, this common factor to all of it, which is that our perceptual experience of the world and of the body and of other things too is not this readout of sensory data. It's a combination of sensory data with the brain's predictions about the causes of that sensory data. And these predictions are inherently bound up with the context in which the sensory data is arriving. And this can explain things like the rubber hand illusion. And in the case of the dress, it's really all our experiences of color. Again, they're very context dependent. Any photographer will know this, that the light coming into the camera can change massively, and you have to do all these white balancing and things like that to make sure you get the image that you want. And our brains are sort of doing all that for us all the time. If you take a piece of white paper from inside an office to outside on a sunny day, it still looks white, but the light coming into your eye is of a completely different character, because it's sort of inside it's very yellowish and outside it's quite bluish. But that's because the ambient light is very different, and we typically don't notice that. The piece of, we will notice the going from indoors to outdoors, but the paper just looks the same color. So our brains are just always doing this, taking the context into account, so that we see things not as they are, but in ways that are useful for us. The whole point of perceiving things as having colors is so that we can sort of track them over time and distinguish them from their background. And it would be completely useless if things just changed color as the ambient lighting changed, and if you went outside, everything suddenly changed color. It would not be, evolution would not and did not design our visual system to work like that.
For sure. It'd definitely change the taste of my morning smoothies, I would assume, based on a banana appearing one particular color. But
if it suddenly goes green, that would not be nice. Yeah.
I think one thing that I like about this particular field of study is it seems to make my world so much bigger than what I may have thought it was. Like, a lot of the time I'll walk around without consciously thinking this. I'll go, okay, I'm me, that's a tree, there's another person. And that's as far as the conversation goes. And you forget about the fact that your senses are so limited, not only by number, but probably by strength. And there'd be so many other things happening in us, around us right now, that we're completely oblivious to. And I'm not sure how often people take it in this direction, but it seems as though it's, I can see where like a spiritual guru and a quantum physicist both get incredibly excited by this prospect, because that idea that you can boil or sort of zoom into something so much closer, or ask questions around the nature of its existence, it makes the world, for lack of a better description, seem so much bigger, brighter, and more exciting than what the mundane description of "this is me, that's a tree" would lead us to believe. But I've got 2 kids, and it's such a cliche that kids are so much more filled with wonder than so many of us who have grown up and just become overly familiar. And I often wonder, it's like watching my kid look at something so basic, it really triggers that recognition in myself that I take so much of this for granted now. I'm not looking at that caterpillar with the same level of excitement as he is.
Yeah, I think there is something about studying this. I mean, of course, it doesn't change. In some sense, my experience of things are just as they always were. And if I walk down the road, I'll see things with this having the same color. Buses move around in the same way. I get equally frustrated and pissed off by things. But there is another level too. If you allow yourself to get there, where you realize that yes, there's this world as it appears. This philosophers have called it the kind of the manifest image, but that is not all there is. The manifest image is both less than what's there, because, as you said, we only have a certain number of senses, and which have limits both in strength and in what they in principle could detect. But it's also more than what's there. And so I think this is the other side of the coin. It's easy to think that we're just we're trapped inside this sort of narrow filter, and the world beyond it is just much richer. But actually it cuts both ways. Now, again, thinking about color, it's not just that our eyes sample only a little bit of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's true. What's out there is a whole spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, from X-rays to radio waves, and the so-called visible spectrum is this tiny thin slice of this vast swathe of reality. And our eyes only detect 3 wavelengths within that visible spectrum anyway, for most of us, unless we're colorblind. But we see more than 3 colors, right? We see billions of different colors. So our experience is not just a filtering down, it's also an expansion. And I think that's a beautiful perspective on it too, that in virtue of our biology, our brains, our bodies, what we experience is both less than and more than what's actually there.
Yeah. I often wonder, like, yeah, people say this quite loosely when they talk about an out of body experience. Where you talk about things like, is it astral travel, or people
Mm.
just speaking about experiences that, like a common human experience is, it seems fairly unnatural. I'm not sure whether you take that as sort of like I don't even know how to describe it, but it seems as though, or maybe a drug experience is a better way to
Mm.
describe it. Like you'll often hear people talk about an experience of psychedelics and how certain realms seem to have been opened up to them. And a lot of the time, especially me when I was younger, I'd listen to those stories and I'd go, "Oh, of course, it's like a dream in your head." But I often wonder whether or not it does open up a particular part of your brain that allows you to see certain things that, as we said before, might be there, but your conscious self or the senses as they usually are unable to pick up.
Maybe I think that there's these experiences, these unusual experiences, whether they're psychedelic experiences, out of body experiences, astral traveling, that various other, deep meditation, and various different ways, breath work. There's many different ways to sort of bring yourself out of the everyday. And I think they can be, well, I mean, one thing is these experiences can be incredibly meaningful for the people that have them. They can often be therapeutic. Sometimes they can be a bit distressing, but certainly in psychedelics, there's a lot of excitement about the therapeutic potential. We'll see how that turns out. But what do they say about this relationship between perception and reality? I think here it's more subtle, and it can be tempting to take these experiences as evidence of what is more real, as if you're stripping away the filters and you're having access to a deeper, more fundamental level of reality. Taken out of body experience. One way to interpret it is, okay, that's evidence that my consciousness is not tied to my brain, that it can in fact sort of leave the brain and head off into the sky. That would be taking the experience both seriously and literally as revealing the nature of things as they really are. I think that's the wrong way to think about it, at least for me. And I think it's whatever works for people, but as a scientist, that's the wrong way to think of it. What I think these experiences show us are the evidence for the range of possible experiences that we are capable of having. And they can, they can reveal things that we would normally take for granted that perhaps we shouldn't take for granted. So the out-of-body experience here has a different interpretation. Instead of being evidence that consciousness can, in fact, leave the brain and go floating around, it's really evidence for our experience of being within the body most of the time, 99.9% of the time, is something the brain is actively creating all the time. It's not just there to be taken for granted. The brain is working hard to create that sense of where the self is. And if you, alter the brain in various ways, whether it's a seizure or psychedelics or a deep spiritual context, then the brain can reach a different conclusion about where the self is and will have an out-of-body experience. So here we still take the experience seriously, but not literally.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I've noticed is we throw around certain words like consciousness quite loosely. I mean, I do this regularly and I haven't really thought that much about what it is that I'm referring to, but I just know that people know roughly what it is I'm trying to talk about. And a lot of the time when you speak about consciousness, like people will try and define that as, oh, okay, you're just talking about your brain, like working as it should. And other people were like, no, I see that more as something separate from consciousness. When you use the word consciousness, what are you actually referring to?
Well, I think it's simultaneously this big mystery, but also it's completely obvious to all of us too. So it's something that doesn't need a background in science or philosophy or anything. Consciousness is any kind of experience. It's what you lose when you go under general anesthesia. So I don't know, Tyson, if you've ever had general anesthesia.
I have.
And it's
Yeah.
not just going to sleep, right? I mean, you are gone, and then you're back, and the ends join up. There's no sense of time passing. You're just not there. Yet you are there as a physical object, and you're still alive, one hopes. But you are not there as a subjective entity. You are just gone. Sleeping is different, right? You can be asleep, but you're typically, you have dreams, there's other kinds of stuff going on in your mind. And when you wake up, you know that some amount of time has passed. Anesthesia is different. So consciousness is really the opposite of general anesthesia. It's not, and then it's not, we have to also, I think, be careful not to define it purely by reference to what it's like to be a human being. When we are conscious, there's many aspects. We experience being a self. We have stream of thoughts. We have memories. We have a particular range of emotions and so on. And that may be how consciousness is for a typical adult human being. But consciousness in general, I think, is best defined by philosopher Thomas Nagel, who says that for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. That's very simple. It just feels like something to be me. Feels like something to be a bat. That was his famous paper. But for a table or a chair, there is nothing it is like to be that thing. They're objects. Even for a computer, it's a complicated object. But unless you believe your computer is having experiences, and some people do, of course, now that we've got AI, there is nothing it is like to be your computer. It is an object, does stuff, but that's it.
Yeah. So when you go under a generalist anesthetic, I mean, this might be me being a little bit thick, but are we saying consciousness is temporarily switched off? Or like, what is the difference? Because I fully relate to what you're saying. Like when I wake up in the morning, I'm fully aware of the fact I've slept through the night. Like simple things might give it away, like the fact it was dark and now it's light. But there is a sense of time passed. Whereas I had a couple of sinus surgeries years ago now, and I was very nervous for the first one. And going under, I remember, well, first of all, I remember like when the anesthetic kicked in, how relaxed I was. And I was like, oh, I've been so scared of this for the last couple of weeks, and that fear's just disappeared at the moment I'm about to go under. But then the speed at which you feel you woke up, it almost felt instant. And yet, it's a very different experience. Like, can you talk more to that? Because that is a really interesting comparison.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, I've had general anesthesia now, I think 3 times, maybe four, I think 3 times. And the last time that I had it was a relatively minor surgery. So I was sort of paying attention to the experience of losing consciousness and then regaining it. And it's very powerful thing to go through. I hesitate to call it an experience to go through because that's the whole point. It's the absence of experience that's the notable thing. No, you're absolutely right. Consciousness is temporarily turned off and reversibly. I mean, that would not be much good if it was only working in one direction. And I mean, other things go on typically in an operating theatre. It's not only that consciousness is turned off, also you have muscle relaxants and paralytic agents and so on, so that, when the surgery is going on, your body is still. But the fundamental point about anesthesia is that it abolishes consciousness, and it seems to do so in a way that is very different from sleep. And yeah, we've talked about how this seems to be the case when we just reflect on the two things happening to us. But it's also the case if you look inside the brain, if you look at brain activity of someone who is asleep and someone who is under, and I want to emphasize, really profound general anesthesia, because you can have light general anesthesia, which is sort of more like sedation, and then you can see some similarities. But if someone's under really profound general anesthesia, which is not uncommon in surgeries, then the brain enters a state which you never see in sleep. It's more similar to conditions like coma or the vegetative state, which of course the anesthesiologist typically won't say because it's not a very reassuring thing to say. It's much nicer to say you'll sleep for a while and then you'll wake up and be fine. But it's technically not true. There's a kind of brain activity called burst pause where you see these bursts of brain activity, and then there's these gaps where it's basically pretty much silent, and then there's another burst of activity. This you don't see in sleep, but you do see it in general anesthesia, and it's become a really fascinating research area about, okay, so what is happening in the brain under anesthesia, and why do anesthetics disrupt consciousness in ways that going to sleep just doesn't? And we still don't
Yeah,
really
and
know. There's some cool ideas out there.
I'd love to know a couple of those cool ideas because it's that seems like a really interesting pattern. I mean, I'm definitely no expert at all when it comes to brainwaves and what they mean. I probably couldn't even point out maybe I could point out the difference between someone who's under a strong general anesthetic and someone who might be sleeping. But that burst of brainwave seems like a really interesting phenomenon. Like, are there any cool theories that you can talk to around that? Because, I mean, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, it's more about the pauses. So that, I mean, one thing that seems to, one way to understand why consciousness is lost in anesthesia is that the brain is put into a state where different parts of the brain are prevented from talking to each other. They're kind of cut off, functionally cut off from each other. And there's a whole series of experiments that show something like this happening. I think the most compelling was done by a colleague and friend of mine in Milan some years ago. And what he did, Marcello Massimini, what he did was, there's this technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is where you have a magnetic coil and you can inject a pulse of energy into the brain in a very controlled way, just on the surface of the head. You don't have to stick a needle in or anything like that. You just magnetic coil, surface of the head, can inject a pulse of energy into the brain, and then you can use EEG, which is this very common method in the lab where you put electrodes on the surface of the head and you can record electrical activity. So by doing this, you can basically stimulate the brain and you can record the activity that results. I like to think of it as sort of banging on the brain with an electrical hammer and then listening to the echo. And by seeing where the echo goes, you can infer whether the brain is talking to itself or not. If it's a very simple echo, like throwing a stone into a pond of still water, you see a big initial response, but then that's it just fades out. But a conscious brain is like throwing a stone into a pond where there's all kinds of waves going back and forth, and you get these complex ripples and sudden patches of quietness and patches of stuff happening. So that you can measure this. You can even put a number to it, how complex the echo is, and that seems to be a good indication of how conscious a person is. It's like a consciousness meter. And anesthetics seem to disrupt the ability for these complex echoes to happen by imposing these little periods of quiet. It's as if the brain starts to chat between parts of itself, and then there's this big, like, everybody shut up, and everybody shuts up, and then they all wake up again, and no one can remember what they were saying. So it's this periodic kind of reset, and that to me is like, I like that. I think there's something there. It's not a full explanation, but it seems like it's on the right track.
Yeah, I had a strange return to consciousness when I came out of my first surgery, and I think it was maybe an allergic reaction to tramadol because I'm not allowed to take it anymore. But I caught myself being super aggressive towards one of the nurses, which is like, for anyone who knows me, I'm not a tough guy. I'm definitely not a fighter. I like to think I'm fairly placid most of the time, and it kind of shocked me. Like, I came to, and she was like being quite aggressive with me, just going, just sit down, like what? And I was sort of caught myself, and I did, but it was perhaps like that return to consciousness, and I caught myself in a situation that I was like super embarrassed and shocked to be caught in.
But I think that there's something really interesting there as well, isn't there? That we like to think of who we are as something that is pretty stable, pretty permanent, unchanging. This is kind of what we mean by identity, that we have a personality. We are a particular kind of person in a way that we feel is valuable and meaningful because it has this character of permanence, of defining us. And then there can be an experience like the one you just described, where you can have a reaction to a particular chemical drug, and you totally change. Your personality is transiently very different. Um, and this is a very, very common observation. It's that you change the brain in some ways. You put different. I mean, we notice, I guess, a more common setting is when people drink too much. And their personality can change quite dramatically, but usually often temporarily, until it accumulates and they become a different person over time. So there can be these kind of dramatic changes, but it does suggest that maybe the experience of being who we are is never this stable, unchanging essence, that it is in fact always changing, always being recreated, reconstructed over time. It's just that most of the time the change is so slow that we don't actually notice that we're always becoming different people.
Yeah, I get excited by that thought when I look at it the right way because, I mean, I remember I finished year 12, last year of high school here in Australia in 2005, and I'm not sure whether I was just slow to catch up, but I remember there was a pretty common conversation amongst our friends that, oh no, like the adult brain matures at 25, and like when you're 25, there you are, that's you. And then, like, if you've got depression or if you're happy, like, congratulations or bad luck, deal with it as you see fit. But the flip side of that, and one thing which I guess a lot of Buddhist monks and teachers have been speaking about for years, is like the power of meditation, your capacity to actually change the shape, the function, the effectiveness of your brain, your emotional response to thoughts. I find, especially when I'm going through stressful moments or maybe patches of, like if I ever go through grief or a flat patch, I find that very message very encouraging and very inspiring because I've seen so many changes in my own life through a focused effort and attention to, whether it's positivity or gratitude, but also the flip side of that if you're not careful. And so, I mean, the idea that brain, to steal the title, I can't remember who wrote it, The Brain That Changes Itself, was like quite a popular book, maybe
Hmm.
for a big reason, because you can obviously see the brain's capacity to change for better or worse if whichever, I guess, depending on the skills or bad habits that you throw at it.
Yeah, but I think that it's not that the brain has this sort of flexibility to change in response to life's events, but I think the deeper thing there, I don't know if this is in that book, is that the brain is always changing. Every
Mm.
experience you have is changing the brain, and consequently we are always changing too. And I'm glad you mentioned the Buddhist perspective again. You mentioned it earlier in the context of the maybe a Buddhist and a quantum physicist having some common ground here. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's a long tradition, especially in these kinds of Eastern traditions like Buddhism and also Hinduism, that recognize that how things seem is not how they are. In Hinduism, there's a concept of Maya, the kind of the world as it appears as illusion, and it's very close to where we started about our experience of the world being a construction. Um, but this also applies to the experience of self, that it is also a kind of construction, that it is always changing, and that just as if I look at the objects on my desk, they appear to have a particular color, but that is a kind of that's not actually how things are. That's a collaboration between my brain and the world. If I have a particular emotional response, maybe it's depression, maybe it's grief, maybe it's joy, that also is not a direct reflection of how things actually are. It's an interpretation, it's a construction. And I think the practice of meditation is partly about allowing people to recognize the truth of that, so that when they have emotions that are difficult, it's not that you no longer have them. It's just that you don't buy into them in the same way, and you recognize them as responses to a situation, but responses that will come and will go. And I think that's the power of meditation, is it can give us this equanimity. It doesn't get rid of the unpleasant experiences, but it allows them to be experienced with a certain degree of equanimity.
Yeah. Is that something you practice? Is that a part of like a daily routine or a routine for
I
yourself?
I would no. I mean, I have practiced that. From time to time, I I go through periods of like, okay, I really need to do this properly. But I'm just haven't mustered the self-discipline because it's very hard, uh, to meditate. It's not just sort of sitting down and relaxing. I don't. Do you meditate?
I'm like you. I've been really undisciplined with it for probably since my first boy was born 4 years ago.
I can imagine that makes it even harder. I mean, I've been on a couple of meditation retreats, which have been super interesting because then back to context. If I'm in the context of that's what I'm here for and this is what everybody is doing, then it's easier. It makes it easier. But the flip side is when you're out of that context, then it becomes hard again. But I wonder that it's having talked to a lot of people who've meditated very extensively and studied meditation and so on. I do think there is some kind of common ground here where uh, whether it's through you know spending a lot of time thinking about how perception works, you come to the same kind of place. Now, I'm really not claiming that studying neuroscience is will get you to enlightenment. I don't think that's true at all. But there is a certain sense in which I've kind of automated within my own mind this this mental reflex to not take things as they are, to recognize the indirectness inherent in all experience, and it's not as practiced as someone who meditates, because meditation is all about the practice of doing that. My approach to it has been more from the abstract, like understand what's going on. But I guess if not to the same place, then I think in the same continent.
For sure. Well, I think when I can see how that works for sure, because I mean, like my whole goal, or I guess the focus of myself, was learning to loosen that emotional attachment between the thought and the feeling. And when you start to question the thoughts that are going through your mind, which I'm sure is like your all day, every day, then naturally you start to take some of your thoughts a little less seriously, potentially. Like you don't see them as 100% right and, accurate predictions of what's going to happen tomorrow based on what's going on right now.
Right, yeah, though I'm not sure I've ever taken my thoughts particularly seriously. But
That's what I mean. Oh, yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Yeah, you strike me as the kind of guy who, I mean, I don't know you well, but you seem fairly unfazed. I can't imagine you getting too stressed, but maybe you can correct me.
well, yeah, I mean, I wish that were the case. I mean, like I think life is stressful. I do think it's stress is a fairly reasonable, rational reaction to the world in which we live, and I think finding ways to deal with that, whether that's through meditation or through some other mechanism, I think is going to be important for each of us. Yeah, I don't think there's a panacea.
For sure. I often say that I mentioned that I'd stopped meditating consistently since my first boy, Charlie, was born. I joke about the fact that my meditation now is just trying to like maintain that emotional gap between responding to just behaviors that do my head in with things
Mm.
that he should know better at the age of 4 that he can't do, like wake me up at 1 o'clock. I feel like I've got some pretty powerful opportunities to practice that emotional disconnect there and fail regularly, but at least come back to that mindset most nights.
I think that's the key, isn't it? I mean, if you can take that general approach, I think you're doing well. I mean, that reminds me of just the practice for for certainly um, some varieties of meditative practice where you notice that your mind has wandered and you gently bring it back. And the fact that your mind has wandered is not a failure. It's going to wander, but the value is in noticing it and bringing it back. And so to develop that competence, yeah, you need to be challenged.
Yeah, I mean, I know where I'm about to take this conversation has been being spoken about for years and years and has been ramped up even more in recent months and years. And so I've got my eye on the clock and recognize we've got about 15 minutes left for the conversation, so we might not be able to dig as deep as we may like to. But the subject of AI is one which has obviously taken the general public's mind by storm in the last 12 to 18 months. But I heard you speaking about it in that first TED talk, I imagine well before then. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying you don't imagine AI ever getting to a point where it's going to have that consciousness in the way that we have it, which I found fairly comforting. But is that still the way you look at it?
That is still my view, and I am not necessarily in the majority here, but it is still what I think. AI has really exploded in the public consciousness in the last couple of years, as you point out, but it's been going along for a long time. My PhD was in AI back in the late 1990s, before it was, before I could get paid well for doing it. So I was ahead of my time in ways which were financially disadvantageous, but there you go. We overestimate the degree to which brains are like computers. Brains are just incredibly complicated systems, and we've always used the dominant technology as our best metaphor for what kind of thing a brain is. At one point, it was a system of pipes, a kind of massive plumbing network. Then it became a network of a kind of telegraph or telephone network. And then it became a computer. A computer became the dominant metaphor. And it's a useful metaphor. There are some ways in which the brain is very computer-like, and it might even be the case that the brain does compute things, in some reasonable meaning of the term. But there are still many differences between brains and computers. Now, the dominant view out there is that these differences aren't significant. I'm not sure it's a dominant view, but a dominant view is that the differences between brains and computers don't really matter from the perspective of whether a computer can be conscious. Like, on this view, consciousness just is a kind of computation. And if you program a computer in the right way, it will also have consciousness. There will be something it would be like to be GPT-6 or 7 or 10, something like that. That's one view, and it might be right. I might be wrong about this, but I think there are many reasons why this view that consciousness is just a matter of computation and that the kind of AI that we have around us is conscious or could be conscious, I think, to me, it's pretty unlikely. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why. I think the more interesting have to do actually with our psychological biases. So why would we think that AI could be conscious? Well, we often think that because of our biases to associate consciousness with other human-like properties, such as intelligence and language. And we tend to bind these things together. We're very anthropocentric creatures in this sense. We take the human as representative, if not definitional or canonical in some way. But intelligence, language, and consciousness are very different things. They come together in us, but they don't necessarily come together in general. There are plenty of other non-human animals out there that are very likely conscious, but don't have language and maybe not that intelligent by our human standards. And AI, especially this recent wave of language model, chatbot type AIs, is almost the opposite to if we're thinking about a fish or a bumblebee or something. They're very different from us in the sense of what they're made out of, whereas a fish or a bumblebee, they have brains, they're made out of biological material. But they're more similar to us in ways which might not matter at all. Like language models speak to us. They seem to be intelligent, at least to some degree, although they're not as smart as AI companies might like us to think they are. They can still be easily tripped up. But because they speak to us, we're very inclined to project qualities into them that they don't in fact have. Qualities like understanding, like consciousness. But our doing that, I think, is more a reflection of our own psychological bias rather than an accurate insight into what's happening inside an AI system. So there's our biases, and then there are just these massive differences which suggest to me that whatever it is that brains do, actually getting a computer to do that is almost impossible. And it's certainly not going to happen just by scaling up the kind of AI that we already have. I mean, we can see this just in one simple way by the amount of energy consumed. So computers do things in ways that require huge amounts of energy, and that's because they have to work on different computers. Like my version of Word has to work on any computer that I've got. brains don't have to do that. In a brain, there's no pressure to separate what it does from what it is. There's no difference in the brain between like the mindware and the wetware, but in a computer, you've got this sharp difference between the software and the hardware. So where my line of thinking has been going over these years, and I'm still trying to make the best case for it that I can without being wholly convinced of it even myself. I'm just trying to stress test the argument, is that consciousness is much more intimately tied to our nature as living creatures than it is to our intelligence or language or the similarity between brains and computers. Consciousness is, in this view, a property of being alive. And if that's the case, then computers at best will just be able to simulate consciousness in the same way that a computer can simulate a weather system without actually getting wet or windy inside a computer simulation of the weather. But it won't actually be conscious, and that's a critical distinction.
Yeah. And so is that sort of the main challenge that you have? Like for the people that are now saying, no, but you've got to see, like we're in the early days of AI. Sure, it can communicate to us with language and appear as though it shares that same form of intelligence as us. So in, a few generations or a few iterations, I should say, time, consciousness will just be a natural next step? Or what is the response to that from people who disagree?
Well, I think that the honest answer is we don't really know. I mean, nobody knows what a sufficient basis for consciousness is. We don't have a theory of consciousness that everyone agrees on, that if these conditions are satisfied, then you have consciousness. There are many theories and they say different things. But it seems, among the many reasons why AI could be conscious, just assuming that it will come along for the ride as AI gets smarter, there's really not any good reason to think that. I mean, that does seem to just reflect our own human biases than anything about the system itself. Certainly we'll get better at convincing us that it's conscious,
For sure.
better at simulating it. But to say that it's actually conscious requires understanding what consciousness is, how it can be a property of embodied, embedded brains. And that takes us in a direction away from just ramping up the intelligence factor of AI systems. Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible in principle, but where I think we're most likely to go is that if it's for the things we build, for the artifacts that we build to be conscious, they'll probably have to be a lot more brain-like than current computers are.
Yeah. I guess a response to like that argument would be like when my kid was born, he was fully conscious and terrible with language. It was, it's not like he's become more conscious or more of a conscious being the more words he can speak.
Well, I mean, you might say in some ways a little bit, right? I mean, language does enrich our ability, our conscious experience of the world, but of course it's not necessary for it at all. But it's also just fascinating how, as society, we've changed how we ascribe consciousness to things other than us. I mean, we have a pretty crappy track record as a species, because of course, if you withhold an ascription of consciousness, then it means you can basically ignore the interests of that thing. It has no interest of its own. You can use it as a tool. And of course, non-human animals have been at the sharp end of that for a very long time. But not only non-human animals. I mean, there was a period of time, certainly in the UK, probably more widespread, where newborn babies were not given anesthesia when they were being operated on, if they needed to be operated on. This I found absolutely remarkable. And the assumption was, well, they didn't really feel pain. So the risk of giving them anesthesia, because there's always a small risk, is like, well, they don't need it because they didn't really feel pain. Like, how would you, from a perspective now, that seems it seems borderline insane, but that was common medical practice. So, this does make me think. So, in a generation or two, what will people think of as natural when it comes to the kinds of things that we ascribe consciousness to? It's such an important question. It's where there's this abstract interest in studying consciousness, but so much of our societal decision making depends on how we answer these questions, that for me it just adds a lot of motivation to really having a better understanding of consciousness where we know it exists in humans and many other animals, and that will allow us to be on surer footing in those cases where uncertainty remains. And that's not only non-human animals, but also human. What about preterm infants? What about fetuses in the womb? When does consciousness start? There's no good answer to that. And then also AI, but also there are all these emerging synthetic biology technologies, things like organoids, mini brains grown in a dish in the lab. Now, these don't do anything interesting. They don't speak to us. So there's no debate, or at least not in the public, there's no debate about this, right? Because they don't grab hold of our biases. But they're made out of the same stuff. They're made out of neurons. They're much more brain-like in ways that might matter for consciousness than GPT-5. So, yeah, we have to navigate this space in a more informed way, and that really just adds impetus for solving the challenge of what is the biological basis of consciousness. It really is an urgent question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to watching it unfold. I've been a big fan of what it is that you've had to teach for a while now. So I appreciate you coming on the show. As I said, I got my eye on the clock. I know you got other things to do with your day than just talk to me. As much as I wish we could just make this the day's priority, but I love you and leave you. But man, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming on,
Tyson. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure.
Anytime. All right, I'll see you later. See you, everybody.